Jake Morrison felt the ship shake hard around him as red lights flashed everywhere in the cockpit. The UES Phoenix was falling apart, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The hyperspace drive had failed during what should have been a simple jump to the next system. Now his ship was spinning out of control toward a planet that looked like a green and brown ball of death from space. The navigation computer was dead. The communication system was making strange noises before it went quiet forever. Even the artificial gravity was failing as Jake felt himself floating up from his pilot seat. He grabbed the emergency straps and pulled them tight across his chest while the ship screamed through the atmosphere of the unknown planet below. His two crew members, Lisa Carter and Ben Rodriguez, were already unconscious in their seats. The emergency foam had deployed around them when the ship first started to fail. Jake could see they were still breathing, but blood was running down Lisa's face from a cut on her forehead. Ben's left arm was bent in a way that meant it was probably broken. The medical bay was on the other side of the ship, and Jake knew he would never make it there before they hit the ground. The planet outside the windows looked wrong. The trees were too tall and too dark. The grass was the color of dried blood. Even the sky had a strange yellow tint that made everything look sick and dangerous. Jake had visited dozens of planets during his years as an exploration captain, but none of them had ever made him feel afraid just from looking at them. The ship hit the ground with a sound like thunder. Jake's head snapped forward, and everything went black for a few seconds. When he opened his eyes again, the cockpit was full of smoke and he could taste blood in his mouth. The emergency lights were still working, but most of the other systems were completely dead. He could hear air leaking out through cracks in the hull somewhere behind him. Jake unbuckled his straps and crawled over to check on Lisa and Ben. Lisa was still breathing, but she would not wake up when he shook her shoulder. Ben's pulse was weak, and his skin felt cold to the touch. Jake knew they needed medical help fast, but the medical bay was on the lower deck, and he could hear water or some other liquid rushing in down there. He grabbed the emergency kit from under his seat and started working on their injuries as best he could. The kit had basic medical supplies and some pain medicine, but nothing that could help with serious head trauma or internal bleeding. Jake wrapped Lisa's head wound and put Ben's arm in a simple sling, but he knew it was not enough. Air outside the ship smelled wrong when Jake opened the emergency hatch. It was too thick and had a sharp taste that reminded him of metal and old meat. Every breath made his throat feel scratchy and his eyes water a little. The gravity on this planet was heavier than Earth normal, which made every movement feel slow and tiring. Jake climbed down from the ship and looked around at his new home. The Phoenix had crashed in a clearing surrounded by trees that were at least 100 feet tall. Their leaves were dark purple and moved even when there was no wind. The grass under his feet was springy, like it was alive, and it made soft squeaking sounds when he walked on it. Something howled in the distance. The sound was deep and long and unlike anything Jake had ever heard before. It seemed to come from everywhere at once and made the hair on his arms stand up. A few seconds later, another howl answered from a different direction, then another and another. Jake realized that whatever lived on this planet was already talking to each other about the strange metal object that had fallen from the sky. Jake went back into the ship and started gathering supplies. The food synthesizer was broken, but he found several emergency food packs that would last him about a week. The water recycler was cracked, but still working enough to give him clean water for a few days. Most importantly, he found the portable power cell that could run his basic equipment for at least a month if he was careful with it. He also grabbed his sidearm and the rifle from the weapons locker. Both weapons were designed to work on any planet, with any atmosphere. The rifle had enough charge packs to fire about 200 shots. The sidearm had enough power for 50 shots. Jake hoped he would not need either weapon, but the sounds coming from the forest around the crash site told him he probably would. Lisa and Ben were getting worse. Their breathing was becoming more shallow, and their skin was getting paler. Jake knew they would not survive much longer without real medical help. The ship's emergency beacon was broken, and even if it was working, there was no guarantee that anyone would receive the signal out here in unexplored space. Jake made a difficult decision. He would focus on his own survival first and worry about getting help for his crew later. If he died trying to save them right now, then all three of them would be dead. But if he could stay alive long enough to figure out this planet, then maybe he could find a way to get them all home. The sun was setting and the howls from the forest were getting closer. The first night on the planet was the longest of Jake's life. He had barricaded himself inside the ship's cargo bay after moving Lisa and Ben to the most secure section he could find. The howls outside never stopped, and sometimes he could hear heavy footsteps walking around the crashed ship. Whatever was out there was big, and it was curious about the metal object that had invaded its territory. Jake did not sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard new sounds that made his heart race. There were scratching noises on the hull like giant claws testing the metal. There were deep breathing sounds right outside the walls. Worst of all were the intelligent sounds like different creatures talking to each other in languages made of growls and clicks and strange musical notes. When the sun finally came up, Jake looked out through the small window in the cargo bay door. What he saw made his blood turn cold. Tracks were everywhere in the dirt around his ship. Some tracks were from creatures with paws bigger than dinner plates. Others showed claws that were longer than his fingers. The strangest tracks looked like they came from something that walked on 6 legs and had feet shaped like human hands but covered in scales. Jake knew he had to explore outside the ship if he wanted to survive. The food and water inside would not last forever, and he needed to understand what kind of creatures lived on this planet. He put on his environmental suit and checked his weapons one more time. The rifle felt heavier than usual in his hands, but the weight was comforting. He opened the cargo bay door slowly and stepped outside. The morning air was thick with fog that had a strange purple color. The fog smelled like flowers, but also like something dead and rotting. Jake could barely see 10 feet in any direction, but he could hear creatures moving through the mist around him. The first predator found him within minutes of leaving the ship. Jake heard a low rumbling sound behind him and turned around to see something that looked like it had crawled out of a nightmare. The creature was 12 feet tall and covered in black scales that reflected the morning light like mirrors. It had 6 legs that ended in claws the size of kitchen knives. Its head was long and narrow with eyes that glowed yellow in the dim light. The creature stared at Jake for a long moment without moving. Jake could see intelligence in those yellow eyes. This was not just a wild animal hunting for food. This was a thinking creature that was trying to decide what to do about the strange alien that had appeared in its world. Jake had faced dangerous animals before on other planets, but never anything like this. Most predators either attacked immediately or ran away when they saw something unfamiliar. This creature was studying him like a scientist examining a new specimen. It tilted its head from side to side and made soft clicking sounds as if it was thinking out loud. When the creature finally moved, it was faster than anything Jake had ever seen. One second it was standing 20 feet away, and the next second it was charging straight at him with its claws extended. Jake barely had time to dive to the side before those razor-sharp claws sliced through the air where his head had been a moment before. Jake rolled behind a piece of wreckage from his ship and tried to catch his breath. The creature turned around and looked for him with the patience of something that had never failed to catch its prey. Its yellow eyes scanned the area methodically, and its nose twitched as it tried to pick up his scent. Instead of running or fighting, Jake did something that surprised both himself and the creature. He started moving from cover to cover in a pattern that kept the wreckage between him and the predator. He was not trying to escape, and he was not trying to attack. He was just making himself hard to catch while he studied his enemy. The creature became confused. It was used to prey that either ran in straight lines or turned to fight when cornered. Jake was doing neither. He was moving with purpose, but not in any pattern the creature recognized. Every time it thought it had Jake cornered, he would appear, somewhere else using the crashed ship parts like a maze. After several minutes of this strange dance, the creature stopped and sat down on its haunches. It made a sound that almost sounded like curiosity. Jake realized that he had just shown this perfect predator something it had never experienced before. He had turned a hunt into a puzzle, and the creature did not know how to solve it. Jake continued, moving through the wreckage while keeping his eyes on the predator. He noticed that it moved in very specific ways. When it turned left, it always took exactly 3 steps before turning its head. When it stalked forward, it always lifted its front right paw first. The creature was following patterns that had been burned into its brain by millions of years of successful hunting. But Jake was not following any patterns. He moved randomly and changed direction without warning. He used tools and obstacles in ways the creature had never seen before. Most importantly, he was thinking several moves ahead, while the creature was only reacting to what was happening right now. The standoff lasted for almost an hour. The creature tried several different approaches, but Jake avoided them all by using tactics that made no sense to a predator that had evolved for direct confrontation. Finally, the creature made a sound that Jake had never heard before from any animal. It sounded frustrated and maybe even a little afraid. The creature backed away slowly while keeping its eyes on Jake. It was not retreating because it was hurt or tired. It was retreating because it had encountered something it could not understand, and that scared it more than any physical threat ever could. Jake watched the creature disappear into the purple fog and felt something change inside him. For the first time since crashing on this planet, he felt like he might actually have a chance to survive. These predators were perfect killing machines, but they were also prisoners of their own perfection. They could not adapt to anything that did not fit their ancient programming. Jake was not perfect at anything, but he could learn and change and think in ways these creatures had never encountered. That might be enough to keep him alive in a world where everything else was designed to kill him. Jake spent the next 3 days watching and learning. He had moved his base of operations to a section of the ship that gave him a good view of the surrounding area, while keeping him hidden from the creatures outside. The ship's sensors were mostly broken, but he had managed to repair one small camera that he could move around to observe the predators. What he discovered amazed and terrified him at the same time. The planet was home to dozens of different predator species, and every single one of them was at the top of its food chain. There were no prey animals anywhere. The creatures survived by hunting each other in an endless cycle of violence that had been going on for millions of years. Each species had its own territory and its own hunting methods. The black-scaled creature that had confronted him on the first day lived in the rocky areas near his crash site. Jake started calling them shadow stalkers because of the way they moved through the darkness. They hunted alone and relied on speed and intelligence to catch their prey. In the trees lived something Jake called sky renders. They looked like giant bats with wingspans over 40 feet and beaks full of teeth like broken glass. They could fly silently through the forest and grab creatures from the ground without making a sound. Jake had watched one of them pick up a shadow stalker and carry it away like it weighed nothing. Underground lived the deep lurkers. Jake had never seen one clearly, but he could tell they were there by the way the ground sometimes moved under his feet. They seemed to hunt by sensing electrical activity from other creatures. Whenever another predator stayed in one place too long, the ground would suddenly explode upward, and something with too many teeth would drag the victim down into tunnels that went deep into the planet. The most dangerous creatures were the ones Jake called bone crushers. They were about the size of elephants, but built like tanks with armor plating and jaws that could bite through solid rock. They lived in the valleys between the hills and came out to hunt during the hottest part of the day when most other creatures were resting. Jake realized that these predators had been fighting each other for so long that they had developed very specific rules about territory and hunting. Each species knew exactly where they could go and when they could hunt without starting a war with their neighbors. It was like a deadly game where everyone knew the rules except Jake. But Jake was starting to learn the rules, and more importantly, he was learning how to break them. The ship's computer was damaged, but still had some basic functions. Jake discovered that he could record sounds and play them back through the ship's external speakers. He started recording the calls that different predators made when they were hunting or claiming territory. His first experiment was simple but effective. He recorded a shadow stalker's territorial call and played it in the area where the sky renders usually hunted. Within an hour, 3 sky renders had descended from the trees to investigate what they thought was an invasion of their airspace. When they found no shadow stalker to fight, they became agitated and started attacking each other instead. Jake watched the sky battle from inside his ship and felt something he had not felt since crashing on this planet. He felt hope. These perfect predators could be manipulated because they had never learned to question their own instincts. They had spent so long being successful that they had forgotten how to doubt themselves. Over the next few days, Jake became bolder with his experiments. He used pieces of metal from his ship to create false scent trails that led predators in circles. He moved rocks and debris to make it look like creatures had been in areas where they were not supposed to be. Most cleverly, he started leaving evidence that suggested he was much larger and more dangerous than he actually was. Jake took some of the ship's emergency flares and set them off in patterns that looked like the territorial markings he had observed from the different predator species. But he made the markings bigger and more elaborate than anything the real predators ever created. When the creatures found these massive territorial claims, they became confused and afraid. The shadow stalker that had first confronted Jake returned several times to investigate the crash site. Each time it found new evidence that something huge and powerful was living in the wreckage. Jake had scattered pieces of metal around the area to look like the remains of creatures that had been torn apart by something with incredible strength. He had used chemicals from the ship's engine to create scents that were similar to predator pheromones but much stronger. The shadow stalker became increasingly nervous during each visit. It would approach the crash site cautiously and spend less time investigating before retreating to a safe distance. Jake could see that the creature was developing something it had probably never experienced before in its entire evolutionary history. It was developing fear. Jake's most successful trick involved the ship's damaged engines. They were leaking a harmless but foul-smelling gas that Jake learned to control by opening and closing various valves. He discovered that he could make the gas smell like different predator species by mixing it with various substances he found around the crash site. When he made the gas smell like Skyrender pheromones and released it near the Shadowstalker territory, the results were immediate. 3 Shadowstalkers came to investigate what they thought was an invasion from above. When they found no Skyrenders to fight, they assumed the flying predators had left behind some kind of chemical weapon. The Shadowstalkers abandoned that section of their territory and warned others of their kind to stay away from the contaminated area. Jake had successfully created a buffer zone around his crash site without firing a single shot or killing a single predator. He had used their own intelligence and territorial instincts against them, but Jake's greatest discovery came when he realized that these predators had no concept of deception. They had never encountered a creature that could lie or pretend to be something it was not. When Jake created false evidence of his presence, they believed it completely because the idea that evidence could be faked had never occurred to them. Jake started to understand that he was not just fighting for survival on this planet. He was introducing concepts that had never existed here before. Ideas like misdirection, psychological warfare, and strategic thinking were as alien to these predators as their claws and fangs were to him. For the first time since crashing, Jake began to think that he might not just survive on this planet, he might actually win. Jake's confidence grew with each successful manipulation of the predators around his crash site. He had been on the planet for 2 weeks and had not only survived, but had actually begun to thrive. The creatures that should have killed him within. Ours were now avoiding his territory and showing signs of genuine fear when they encountered evidence of his presence. But Jake was not content to simply hide and defend himself anymore. He had learned enough about the predator ecosystem to realize that he could do much more than just survive. He could actually take control of the entire area around his crash site by turning the hunters against each other. His first major operation targeted the water source that several predator species shared. About half a mile from his ship, there was a natural spring that provided clean water for the shadow stalkers, some of the smaller flying predators, and occasionally even the massive bone crushers when they traveled through the area. Jake had salvaged several chemical compounds from his ship's damaged systems. Most of them were harmless cleaning agents and fuel additives, but he discovered that when mixed together, they created a substance that smelled absolutely terrible, but was not actually dangerous to drink. The mixture smelled like rotting meat mixed with burning plastic and was so strong that it could be detected from over a mile away. Jake waited until the middle of the night when most predators were either sleeping or hunting in other areas. He carried containers of his chemical mixture to the spring and carefully poured them into the water upstream from where the creatures usually drank. The chemicals would make the water smell and taste horrible but would not actually poison anyone who drank it. The next morning, Jake watched through his repaired camera as a group of sky renders approached the spring for their daily water. The flying predators landed near the water and immediately recoiled from the terrible smell. They made angry screeching sounds and flew in circles around the spring as if they were looking for whatever had contaminated their water source. Within an hour, a shadow stalker arrived at the spring and had the same reaction. But instead of just leaving like the sky renders had done, the shadow stalker began investigating the area around the spring. It found scent traces that Jake had carefully planted the night before. Scent traces that smelled exactly like the bone crushers from the valley. The shadow stalker became enraged. In its mind, the evidence was clear. The bone crushers had poisoned the spring that multiple species depended on for survival. This was an act of war that could not be ignored. The shadow stalker let out a howl that Jake had never heard before. It was not a hunting call or a territorial warning. It was a call for revenge. Over the next several hours, more shadow stalkers arrived at the contaminated spring. Each one examined the evidence and reached the same conclusion. The bone crushers had committed an unforgivable crime and needed to be punished. By sunset, a pack of 12 shadow stalkers was moving toward the valley where the bone crushers lived. Jake followed the shadow stalkers using his suit's stealth capabilities and watched what happened next from a safe distance. The shadow stalkers were fast and intelligent, but the bone crushers were armored killing machines that weighed 10 times as much. Under normal circumstances, the two species avoided each other because a fight between them would be costly for both sides, but these were not normal circumstances. The shadow stalkers believed they were fighting to protect their survival, and the bone crushers had no idea why they were being attacked. The battle that followed was unlike anything in the planet's recent history. The shadow stalkers used their speed and intelligence to attack the bone crushers from multiple directions at once. They targeted weak points in the armor and used hit and run tactics that kept the larger predators off balance. The bone crushers fought back with devastating force, but their attacks were poorly coordinated because they did not understand what was happening. When the battle was over, 3 shadow stalkers were dead, and 2 bone crushers had been severely wounded. More importantly, both species were now convinced that the other had started an unprovoked war. The surviving shadow stalkers retreated to plan their next attack while the bone crushers began preparing their defenses for what they expected would be continued aggression. Jake watched the aftermath of his manipulation with a mixture of satisfaction and unease. He had successfully turned 2 of the planet's most dangerous predator species against each other, but the level of violence had been more intense than he had expected. These creatures were not just fighting over territory anymore. They were fighting For their lives against enemies they believed wanted to destroy them completely. But Jake could not afford to feel guilty about what he had done. His own survival depended on keeping these predators focused on fighting each other instead of hunting him. And his plan was working better than he had dared to hope. Within days of the battle at the spring, the conflict had spread to other species. The Skyrenders had seen the Shadow Stalkers and Bone Crushers fighting and assumed that the territorial agreements that had kept peace for centuries were breaking down. They began expanding their own territory and attacking ground-based predators that had never been their enemies before. The deep lurkers sensed the chaos happening on the surface and became more aggressive in their underground hunting. They started attacking creatures that were wounded or distracted by the fighting above ground. This caused even more panic among the surface predators who now had to worry about threats from below as well as from their traditional rivals. Jake had introduced something into the ecosystem that had never existed before on this planet. He had created doubt and suspicion among creatures that had lived according to stable rules for millions of years. The predators no longer trusted their ancient territorial agreements or their understanding of how their world worked. From his position, at the center of the chaos, Jake continued to manipulate the situation. He planted more false evidence of territorial violations. He created fake scent trails that suggested predators were moving into areas where they did not belong. Most effectively, he used his chemical weapons to make it seem like different species were marking territory in ways that violated every rule the creatures had ever known. The predators of this planet had evolved to be perfect killers, but they had never evolved to handle psychological warfare. They could not comprehend that evidence could be faked, or that an enemy might use deception instead of direct force. Every trick Jake played on them seemed completely real because they had no mental framework for understanding lies or manipulation. Jake realized that he had stumbled onto something much more powerful than any weapon. He had discovered that human intelligence was not just different from the intelligence of these predators, it was alien in ways that made it almost impossible for them to defend against. The hunters were becoming the hunted, and they did not even know who was hunting them. 3 months had passed since Jake's ship crashed on the planet, and the world around him was no longer recognizable. The careful balance that had existed between the predator species for millions of years had completely collapsed. Where once there had been order and predictable territorial boundaries, there was now chaos and constant warfare. Jake had moved his base of operations to an ancient stone structure he had discovered about 2 miles from his crash site. The building was clearly not natural and showed signs of advanced engineering, but whoever had built it was long gone. The structure was partially underground and provided both protection and an excellent vantage point for observing the surrounding area. From his new headquarters, Jake could see the devastation his psychological warfare had caused across the landscape. The spring where he had started his first major operation was now completely abandoned. No creature would go near it, even though Jake had long since stopped, adding chemicals to the water. The predators had marked the area as permanently contaminated and would not risk approaching it. The Shadow Stalker population had been reduced by more than half through their ongoing war with the Bone Crushers. The survivors had split into smaller groups that no longer trusted each other and often fought among themselves. Jake had heard reports of Shadow Stalkers attacking their own kind because they suspected them of being allied with their enemies. The Skyrenders had abandoned their traditional territory in the tall trees and moved to the rocky cliff areas where they were constantly fighting with the cliff-dwelling predators that lived there. Their population was also declining rapidly as they spent more energy fighting than hunting for food. Most dramatically, the deep lurkers had become so aggressive that they were attacking everything that moved on the surface. The underground predators had apparently decided that the chaos above ground meant that all territorial agreements were void. They no longer waited for wounded or distracted prey, but actively hunted anything they could catch. Jake had created a world where every predator was afraid of every other predator. The concept of safe territory or predictable behavior had been destroyed. Creatures that had followed the same patterns for countless generations were now changing their behavior daily as they tried to adapt to a world that no longer made sense to them. But Jake's greatest achievement was not the chaos he had created among the predators. His greatest achievement was that he had become completely invisible to them. The creatures were so focused on fighting each other that they had stopped looking for the alien presence that had started all their problems. Jake had become a ghost that moved through their world, leaving no trace of his passing. He had learned to mask his scent using local plants and minerals. He moved through the landscape using paths and techniques that left no tracks the predators could follow. Most importantly, he had learned to think like a predator while acting in ways no predator could predict. The ancient structure Jake now lived in had become the center of an elaborate network of observation posts and supply caches. He had established hidden monitoring stations throughout the area that allowed him to track the movement and behavior of every major predator group. He knew where they hunted, where they slept, and where they were most vulnerable to manipulation. Jake had also discovered that the building contained evidence of its former inhabitants. There were carvings on the walls that showed creatures that looked almost human, but with longer arms and larger eyes. The carvings depicted these beings living peacefully in cities and growing crops in organized fields. But there were also carvings that showed the arrival of the predators and the destruction of the civilization that had once thrived on this planet. Jake realized that he was not the first intelligent being to crash land on this world. Long ago, there had been a peaceful species that had tried to build a society here. The predators had destroyed them not through direct attack, but by making it impossible for them to maintain the cooperation and trust that civilization required. But Jake was different from those ancient inhabitants. He was not trying to build anything or cooperate with anyone. He was fighting a war using weapons the predators could not understand or defend against. And he was winning. Jake's latest operation involved the creation of phantom territories. He had begun marking large areas with fake scent boundaries that suggested the presence of a new predator species. The markings were unlike anything any of the existing predators had ever encountered, but they followed the basic patterns that all territorial creatures understood. The phantom territories were strategically placed to cut off important hunting grounds and water sources. When the real predators encountered these mysterious boundaries, they had to make difficult choices. They could respect the markings and lose access to resources they needed to survive, or they could cross the boundaries and risk war with an unknown enemy that might be more dangerous than anything they had ever faced. Most chose to respect the phantom boundaries because the alternative was too frightening to consider. Jake had created an invisible predator that controlled vast areas of the planet without ever showing itself or engaging in direct combat. The real predators were giving up their territory to something that existed only in their imaginations. Jake's psychological manipulation had evolved far beyond simple tricks and misdirection. He was now practicing a form of warfare that operated entirely in the minds of his enemies. He was rewriting the mental maps that the predators used to understand their world and replacing them with new maps that made no sense but could not be ignored. The predators were developing behaviors that had never been seen in their species before. They were becoming paranoid and suspicious of everything around them. They were abandoning hunting grounds that had been used safely for generations. They were attacking their own kind because they could no longer tell friend from enemy. Most importantly, they were learning to be afraid. Fear was an emotion that these perfect predators had never needed before because they had never encountered anything that could threaten them. But now they lived in constant fear of invisible enemies and unknown dangers that might be lurking anywhere. Jake had introduced the concept of psychological terror to a world that had never known it existed. He had proven that the human mind was more dangerous than claws or fangs or armor plating. In a world full of perfect killers, the ability to think in ways no one else could imagine had made him the ultimate predator. The hunters had become the hunted, and the hunted had become the hunter. Jake was no longer fighting for survival. He was fighting for control of an entire planet. And he was very close to winning. 6 months after his crash landing, Jake Morrison stood on the highest platform of the ancient structure and looked out over a planet that had been completely transformed. The world that had once been ruled by perfect predators was now ruled by fear and uncertainty. And at the center of that fear was a single human who had never killed a single predator in direct combat. The morning air was cleaner now because there were fewer predators breathing it. The ecosystem that had been stable for millions of years had collapsed under the weight of constant warfare and psychological manipulation. Many species had been reduced to tiny populations that spent more time hiding than hunting. Others had abandoned their traditional territories entirely and fled to distant parts of the planet. Jake's communication equipment had finally picked up a signal 3 days earlier. A rescue ship was on its way and would arrive within the week. But Jake was no longer the desperate crash survivor who had been trying to stay alive long enough to be rescued. He had become something else entirely. He had become the apex predator of an entire world. The rescue ship's first message had been a standard emergency response asking for his location and medical status. Jake had responded with coordinates and assured them that he was in good health. But he had not told them about what he had accomplished on this planet. He was not sure they would believe him, and he was not sure he wanted them to know. Jake had spent the last few days documenting everything he had learned about psychological warfare against alien predators. His notes filled dozens of files in the portable computer he had salvaged from his ship. The techniques he had developed could revolutionize how humans dealt with dangerous alien life forms throughout the galaxy. But Jake was also troubled by what he had done. He had destroyed an ecosystem that had existed for millions of years. He had turned perfect killing machines into nervous, frightened creatures that jumped at shadows. He had proven that human intelligence could be more destructive than any weapon ever invented. The predators that remained in the area around his base had learned to recognize his presence even when they could not see him. They would flee immediately if they detected any sign that he was nearby. Jake had become a legend among creatures that had never believed in anything they could not see or smell or hear. Jake walked down from the observation platform and checked on Lisa Carter and Ben Rodriguez. One more time. They were both still alive in the medical pods he had constructed using salvaged equipment from his ship. The pods could keep them stable, but they could not heal the severe injuries they had suffered in the crash. They needed real medical facilities and trained doctors if they were going to recover completely. Jake had managed to keep his crewmates alive for 6 months, using nothing but emergency medical supplies and equipment he had jury-rigged from ship. Components. It had been almost as challenging as his psychological war against the predators. But Jake had learned that humans could adapt to any challenge if they were willing to think creatively and work with whatever resources they had available. The rescue ship arrived exactly when they had predicted. Jake watched from his hidden observation post as the sleek vessel landed in the clearing where his own ship had crashed 6 months earlier. The rescue team consisted of 4 people in environmental suits who moved cautiously through the wreckage looking for survivors. Jake had decided not to reveal his current location immediately. He wanted to observe how the rescue team reacted to a planet full of apex predators. He was curious to see if they would survive long enough for him to make contact with them. But something strange happened. The predators that should have investigated. The new arrivals stayed hidden in the forest. The creatures that should have seen the rescue team as either prey or territorial invaders simply watched from a distance without approaching. The planet's most dangerous hunters were afraid to get close to anything that might be connected to the invisible force that had been terrorizing them for months. Jake realized that his reputation had become so fearsome that it now protected anyone who came near his territory. The predators assumed that the rescue ship was either another manifestation of the mysterious enemy they could not understand or was somehow under his protection. Either way, they were not willing to risk attacking it. Jake activated his emergency beacon and guided the rescue team to his location in the ancient structure. The team leader was a woman named Captain Amy Foster, who had been conducting search and rescue operations in deep space for over 20 years. She had seen crash survivors in every possible condition, but she had never seen anyone who looked as healthy and confident as Jake did after spending 6 months alone on a death world. Captain. Foster asked Jake how he had managed to survive, and Jake gave her a simplified version of the truth. He told her that he had learned to avoid the predators by understanding their behavior patterns and staying out of their way. He did not mention the psychological warfare or the systematic destruction of the planet's ecosystem. The rescue team was amazed by the medical equipment Jake had built to keep his crewmates alive. They were even more amazed by the detailed notes he had compiled about the local predator species. Jake had documented the behavior patterns of dozens of different creatures with scientific precision that would be invaluable to future exploration missions. But what impressed the rescue team most was how the predators reacted to Jake's presence. When Jake walked through the forest with the rescue team, the creatures that should have attacked them immediately stayed hidden and silent. It was as if the entire planet was holding its breath, waiting for Jake to leave. Captain Foster asked Jake if he had any idea why the predators seemed to be afraid of him. Jake told her that he thought they had learned to associate his scent with danger after several close encounters early in his stay. He suggested that the predators had simply decided he was too much trouble to hunt. The truth was much more complex than that. Jake had fundamentally altered the psychology of an entire planet's ecosystem. He had introduced concepts like deception, long-term planning, and psychological manipulation to creatures that had never encountered such things before. The predators were not just afraid of Jake personally. They were afraid of the new type of thinking he represented. Jake helped the rescue team load Lisa and Ben into medical pods aboard their ship. Both of his crewmates would make full recoveries once they received proper medical treatment. Jake felt a sense of satisfaction knowing that he had successfully kept them alive long enough to be rescued. As the rescue ship prepared to leave, Jake took one last look at the planet that had been his home for 6 months. He had arrived as a desperate crash survivor and was leaving as the conqueror of an entire world. He had proven that human intelligence was the most dangerous force in the galaxy when applied creatively and without restraint. But Jake also knew that he was leaving behind a world that would never be the same. The predators would eventually recover from the chaos he had created, but they would never again be the perfect, confident hunters they had been before his arrival. They had learned that there were things in the universe more dangerous than claws, and fangs, and armor plating. Jake had taught an entire planet to be afraid, and that lesson would echo through their evolution for millions of years to come. The next time humans encountered these creatures, they would find them changed in ways that could never be undone. As the rescue ship lifted off and left the planet behind, Jake Morrison smiled and began planning his next mission. The galaxy was full of dangerous worlds and hostile alien species. But Jake had learned something that would make him invaluable to human exploration efforts throughout the universe. He had learned that the human mind was the ultimate weapon, and he was just getting started with learning how to use it.